Welcome to this GCSE History Predicted Paper Walkthrough, Day 4 of 7. This is for Elizabeth Predicted Paper B. Hopefully you have watched the American West A and B walkthroughs and the Elizabeth A walkthrough. Top tips haven't changed from them. Have a go at the questions before you watch the video and then self-assess your answers based on the mark schemes, but also based on the model answers. Compare your answers to model answers and ask yourself what is missing. As a reminder, you can find all of the predicted papers for Paper 2 on Google Classroom. There's not always one correct way of answering the questions, and other approaches may be valid. I've tried to talk about as many approaches as possible, but I would have missed some because I don't have an infinite amount of time. And if you're not sure about anything, ask your teacher or ask me. Features. So for your describe one feature question on Elizabeth, you are awarded 1 mark for identifying a valid feature and a 2nd mark for supporting information. My first feature on Predicted Paper B is describe one feature of the Rodolphi plot. Now, the biggest mistake you can make here is talking about the wrong plot. So you've got to make sure you know which plot the Rodolphi plot was and how it's different to the Throckmorton and the Babington plots. You could say that the plot aimed to overthrow Elizabeth and that Rodolphi wanted Mary Queen of Scots to become queen instead, so that Catholicism could be restored in England, which would get you 2 marks because you've identified the feature, overthrowing Elizabeth, and then the supporting information, wanting Mary Queen of Scots to become queen instead to restore Catholicism. You could also say that it involved foreign Catholic powers. Rodolphi carried messages to the Pope, Philip II of Spain, and the Duke of Alba to gain support for an invasion of England. So 1 mark for foreign Catholic powers, 1 mark for naming the foreign Catholic powers. Plot needed Spanish troops to invade England. Philip II instructed the Duke of Alba to prepare 10,000 troops to cross the Channel. The plot depended on the Duke of Norfolk. He was supposed to marry Mary Queen of Scots, which would unite Catholic and Protestant nobles against Elizabeth, and the plot was uncovered by Elizabeth's government. Coded letters meant for Rodolphi were discovered at Dover, along with further letters and £600 in gold. It's only described one feature. My favourite feature here would be the 3rd one, because it's got the supporting detail that the examiner is going to definitely give 2 out of 2 for. The 2nd one would definitely get you 2 out of 2. Last one definitely get you 2 out of 2. 4th one should get you 2 out of 2. The top one depends what mood they're in. I think it should get you 2 out of 2, but it purely depends what mood the exam board are in. So that's describe one feature of Rodolphi plot. Our next one is describe one feature of Elizabethan sports, and you've got lots of examples here you can use. You only need one feature. Hopefully you put something like this. Elizabethan football was very violent. Players could pick up the ball, trip opponents, and games could last for hours. Elizabethan hurling had different versions. Hurling to goals in East Cornwall had rules, but in West Cornwall, hurling to the country had no rules. Elizabethan wrestling was very popular. 2 competitors tried to throw each other to the ground and hold them there, often during fairs or market days. Elizabethan hunting varied by social class. The nobility would hunt deer and use hawking, while poorer people hunted rabbits. And then finally, nobles were expected to be skilled at fencing. These skills were used in tournaments where around 10% of contenders could be injured. So stick to one Elizabethan sport. You don't get more marks for talking about more than one sport. You just need one feature, and just make sure you have supporting detail for that sport. So each of those would definitely get you 2 out of 2. Next question is the explain why question. This is out of 12. Have a look at level 4, what you need to be doing for 10 or more out of 12. An analytical explanation directed consistently at the conceptual focus of the question, showing a line of reasoning that is coherent, i.e. it makes sense, sustained, as in it's throughout the answer, and logically structured. So you're talking about each factor in a separate paragraph. And then accurate and relevant information precisely selected to address the question directly with wide-ranging knowledge and understanding. So you can't get into level 4 if you only write about 2 things. That means if you only write about the things in the bullet points, the absolute maximum you can get, if you look at the level 3 descriptor, is 8 marks. So make sure you write about 3 things, make sure you go beyond the bullet points. My 12th marker is explain why the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569, and you could use James Pilkington and patronage. You must also use information of your own. Now, with this question, there's really only three things you can talk about. So I would avoid writing about anything which isn't one of these. Religion's the obvious one. The Northern Earls wanted to make the North Catholic again. You've then got patronage, or the loss of power of the Northern Earls, and make sure you go into the exam with two good examples of how the Northern Earls lost their patronage from Elizabeth. And finally, the role of Mary Queen of Scots and uncertainty over the succession, who would succeed Elizabeth. So the revolt takes place because even Elizabeth's loyal nobles are concerned about who will succeed her. So how would we structure these into paragraphs? Here's our religion paragraph. So in bold, clear reason why, italics, detailed knowledge, underlined analysis. So we have one reason why the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 was because of religion. Much of the north of England remained strongly Catholic, especially nobles like the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, even after Elizabeth's religious settlement made England officially Protestant. Elizabeth appointed the Protestant James Pilkington as Bishop of Durham in 1561, hoping to reduce Catholic influence in the north, but he was unpopular and made many northerners more hostile to the religious settlement. This made rebellion more likely because the Northern Earls and their supporters saw Elizabeth's government as a threat to their traditional religion, so they felt they needed to act to defend Catholic worship and remove Protestant influence. Therefore, the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 because religious opposition to Elizabeth's Protestant rule encouraged Catholic nobles in the north to rebel. So we've got a strong, developed explanation here in underlined font. And that's religion. So you could just say they wanted to make England Catholic again, but you need the supporting detail. North remains Catholic despite the religious settlement, and you've got to talk about James Pilkington. He was appointed Bishop of Durham, but he was Protestant, and he was unpopular with the Catholics. And the second reason then is patronage and a loss of power. We can see this in our opening sentence. Another reason why the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 was because the Northern Earls had lost patronage, power and influence. Under Mary I, the Earl of Northumberland had been responsible for defending the border against Scotland, but Elizabeth reduced his influence by appointing the Earl of Sussex, a southerner, as President of the Council of the North. In addition, Elizabeth took Northumberland's valuable copper mine in 1567, which cost him money and contributed to his financial difficulties. This made rebellion more likely because Northumberland and Westmoreland felt that Elizabeth had taken traditional Northern influence away from them and given it to rivals or trusted new men. Therefore, the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 because the Earls wanted to regain the power, patronage and status they had lost under Elizabeth. So you'll notice here that the explanation is two sentences. The first one is talking about how it makes a revolt possible, and then the second one links back to the question using the wording of the question. So first sentence explains, second sentence links back. Final paragraph, Mary Queen of Scots and uncertainty over the succession. So, a final reason why the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 was because of Mary Queen of Scots and the uncertainty over the succession. Elizabeth refused to name an heir, which worried many of her loyal nobles because there was no clear plan for what would happen when she died. Mary Queen of Scots had a strong claim to the English throne, and unlike Elizabeth, she had a son, James, which made her seem like a more secure alternative. The revolt also grew out of a wider plan for Mary to marry the Duke of Norfolk, which some nobles hoped would force Elizabeth to name Mary as her successor. This made rebellion more likely because Mary gave the Northern Earls a realistic alternative monarch to support, a Catholic claimant who could unite opposition to Elizabeth. Therefore, the revolt of the Northern Earls took place in 1569 because Mary and the succession gave the rebels a person around which to organise their challenge to Elizabeth. Now, if this came up as a 16 marker, you would have to make a judgment as to which one of these three reasons was most important for why the revolt took place. And that's entirely up to you to argue. One might argue that religion dominates and the main reason why they wanted to do the revolt was to change religion, and the other factors were secondary. You could also argue, of course, that there would not have been a revolt without Mary Queen of Scots, because there'd be nobody to organise it around. And because the whole revolt involved removing Elizabeth, or at least weakening her power, having an alternative monarch was fundamental to revolt taking place. So that's our 12th marker on why the revolt of the Northern Wales took place. We then have our 16 markers. How far do you agree? Now, those of you who've already done these questions in your predicted paper will note they're quite easy as Elizabeth's 16 markers go. So we have Elizabeth's legitimacy amongst Catholics was the biggest challenge she faced when she became monarch in 1558. How far do you agree? With the bullet points Anne Boleyn and inherited debt. Our alternative is commercial rivalry was a main reason for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations between 1569 and 1585. How far do you agree? Bullet points Nombre de Dios, 1572, and mercenaries in the Netherlands. Again, if you look at a bullet point and you go, I don't know what this means, if you've forgotten what a mercenary is, you can use your own information. What matters is that you use information beyond what's in the bullet points to get the highest possible mark. So we'll have a look at how we might approach the first question and then the second question. So, challenges to Elizabeth. Is legitimacy amongst Catholics the biggest challenge, yes or no? Here's how I would go about it. So I would talk about legitimacy, religion, and financial problems. The legitimacy paragraph obviously is an agree paragraph. So the Pope refused to grant Henry VIII a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So Catholics believed Henry's marriage to Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was invalid. Catholics therefore believed Elizabeth was born out of wedlock to unmarried parents, and that made her illegitimate and unable to rightfully inherit the throne. Then Henry VIII declared his marriage to Anne Boleyn invalid in 1536 when he executed her, and that meant if Henry VIII didn't recognise the marriage, then he didn't recognise Elizabeth was a legitimate monarch either. And although Henry did return Elizabeth to a line of succession in 1543, the damage was already done. So that's what I put in my agree paragraph. In terms of a paragraph on religion, we've got to remember that England has been on a religious roller coaster. So it was Protestant under Edward VI. It returned to Catholicism under Mary I. Most people didn't want more turbulent religious change. Elizabeth also inherited a country where all of the church, clergy and bishops were all Catholic. So it would take a long time and it would be hard work to return everything back to a Protestant faith. Protestants who had fled abroad under Mary were now returning. They wanted a more Protestant settlement to religion, and France, Spain and Scotland were Catholic, so changing religion could anger them. So religion's a huge problem for Elizabeth, because no matter what she does, people aren't going to be happy. And then finally, financial problems. £300,000 of inherited debt from Mary I. Mary had taken England to war with France, and much of that debt had been racked up from the unsuccessful war. Elizabeth's most common source of income was rent from the Crown lands, but as rents were fixed, it couldn't keep up with inflation and couldn't keep up with increasing costs. Now, a solution for Elizabeth to raise money would be to raise taxes, but it'd be unpopular for two reasons. First of all, heavy taxation could make her unpopular, but secondly, raising subsidies, a form of tax, relied on Parliament, and Elizabeth did not want to rely on Parliament because she cannot control the elections of MPs, and therefore she doesn't want to give MPs, members of Parliament, more influence over her role. So, like I did on the predicted paper A, I'm going to show you two potential introductions you could write. Before I do that, it's well worth remembering there are lots of other things you could write about as well. You could write about Elizabeth's marriage problems and the succession. This was a problem, of course, because she didn't have a child, and therefore, so long as she didn't have a child, Mary, Queen of Scots, would be the heir to the throne. You've got foreign threats, particularly France and Scotland. We'll talk a bit more about that in predicted paper C. You've got the problem of the Privy Council, her closest group of advisors, who she had to appoint carefully. And you've also got the problem of her gender. Now, be very careful if you were to write about gender, not to go a bit too woolly on this one, talking about people didn't like women. Partly true, but the previous monarch had been a queen too, and you need to consider why that would make Elizabeth's role more difficult because the previous queen, Mary I, had been unpopular. People assumed that another woman would bring about a similar level of failure. Here are our two introductions. If you agree for legitimacy as the biggest challenge, you'd go for something like this. I agree with the statement because Elizabeth's legitimacy amongst Catholics was the biggest challenge she faced in 1558. Religious division and financial problems were problems Elizabeth could try to manage through compromise and careful policy, whereas Catholic doubts about her legitimacy made her rule vulnerable from the very beginning because some people believed she should never have inherited the throne. So she can manage religion, she can manage financial problems, she can't manage legitimacy, and that's why it would be most important, the biggest challenge. On the other hand, if you were to disagree overall, you could say that religious division and financial problems were bigger challenges for Elizabeth in 1558. Although some Catholics saw Elizabeth as illegitimate because she was Anne Boleyn's daughter, religious division affected the whole country, and inherited debt limited Elizabeth's ability to govern, whereas legitimacy was mainly a threat from one religious group rather than a problem for everyone. So the criteria used if you're disagreeing would be legitimacy doesn't affect the whole country. Other issues, especially financial problems and especially religious division, do affect the whole country, therefore they are bigger challenges. Let's look at how we'd write individual paragraphs. Here's our legitimacy paragraph. In bold at the top, we have a sentence which uses the wording of a question. I agree with the statement because Elizabeth's legitimacy amongst Catholics was a major challenge when she became monarch in 1558. The bit in italics is the important knowledge. It's really easy to get this mixed up, so if you're not confident about legitimacy, read it carefully. The Pope had refused to grant Henry VIII a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, so many Catholics believed Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was invalid. As Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter, Catholics could argue that she was born out of wedlock and therefore had no rightful claim to the throne. This problem was made worse because Henry VIII had declared Mary illegitimate when he married Anne Boleyn, but then later placed both Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession in 1543. This was a big challenge because it meant Catholic opposition to Elizabeth was not just about religion, but about whether she had the right to rule at all. If Catholics believed Elizabeth was illegitimate, they could justify supporting a rival claimant and refusing to accept her authority. This agrees with the statement because Elizabeth's legitimacy amongst Catholics directly threatened her position as queen from the very beginning of her reign. So Catholics were not just unhappy about Elizabeth's religion, they also believed she was not a legitimate monarch. So that'd be our agree paragraph. Here's our first disagree paragraph on religion, and you'll notice as you get towards the end of this paragraph, it compares religion to legitimacy. So in bold at the top, I disagree with the statement because religious division was also a major challenge for Elizabeth when she became monarch in 1558. In italics, we have our knowledge. England had been Protestant under Edward VI, but a return to Catholicism under Mary I, which meant the country had already experienced years of religious change. When Elizabeth became queen, the church, clergy and bishops were still Catholic, so it would be difficult for her to make England Protestant again without facing opposition. At the same time, Protestants who had fled abroad under Mary were now returning to England, and many wanted a more Protestant religious settlement. This was a big challenge because Elizabeth had to find a religious compromise that would satisfy enough people without causing rebellion or angering powerful Catholic countries such as France, Spain and Scotland. If she changed religion too quickly, Catholics might resist. But if she did not make England Protestant enough, Protestants might be disappointed. This disagrees with the statement because religious division was a wider challenge than Elizabeth's legitimacy, as it affected the whole country and shaped one of the first major decisions of her reign. Importantly on this question, it's challenges in 1558, it's not challenges after 1558. So, if you know about Catholic and Puritan challenges to religious settlement and the problems that Spain and France give her in the 1560s and 70s and 80s, that's great, but you can't talk about that on this question because the challenge is when Elizabeth became monarch. Final paragraph on financial problems. So I disagree with the statement because financial problems were also a major challenge for Elizabeth when she became monarch in 1558. Elizabeth inherited a debt of £300,000 from Mary I, linked partly to the cost of war with France. The Crown's main source of income was rent from Crown lands, but these rents were fixed, so Elizabeth's income could not easily rise to match increasing costs. Elizabeth also did not want to raise taxes too heavily, because this could make her unpopular, and relying too much on Parliament to raise subsidies could give MPs more influence over her rule. This was a big challenge because money affected Elizabeth's ability to govern effectively, defend England, reward loyalty, and maintain royal authority. Even if her right to rule was accepted, Elizabeth still needed enough money to make her government work. This disagrees with the statement because financial problems were an immediate practical challenge, whereas legitimacy amongst Catholics was a serious but more limited threat from one religious group. So in the underlined section and the final bold section, we have that comparison back to legitimacy. Yes, the right to rule is an issue, but even if Elizabeth didn't have a problem with legitimacy, she still had the problem with financial problems. It's a practical challenge. So conclusions. Here agree conclusion, if we agreed overall. As you'll notice, it's 3 sentences long. First sentence in bold, in conclusion, I agree with the statement. Very simple. Second sentence in italics starts with the word admittedly. Someone might disagree, because religious division affected the whole country while inherited debt created immediate practical problems for Elizabeth's government. Final sentence, underlined, starts with the word however. I agree more, because legitimacy amongst Catholics was the most serious challenge to Elizabeth's authority itself. Debt could be managed through careful policy, and religion could be compromised over. But if Catholics believed that Elizabeth had no rightful claim to the throne, they could justify rejecting her rule completely. So legitimacy more important because she can't manage the problem. She can manage religion, she can manage financial problems, she can't manage legitimacy. Here we go, answer. Conclusion. So in conclusion, I disagree with the statement. Admittedly, someone might agree because Catholic doubts about Elizabeth's legitimacy directly challenged her right to be queen, especially because she was Anne Boleyn's daughter. However, I disagree more because religious division and financial problems were wider and more immediate challenges affecting everyone in England, meaning these problems had a broader impact on the stability of her reign than legitimacy amongst Catholics alone. So the scale of the impact there being used as criteria. The scale of the impact and how deeply it affected people as well. So that's our first choice 16 marker. Here's our second one, Anglo-Spanish relations. Is commercial rivalry the main reason for these getting worse? Note the dates, 1569 to 1585. You've got to be very particular about what you talk about. So here's what I have. Commercial rivalry is an agree. You've got to be really careful. San Juan de Ulua, which is ultimately the battle where Hawkins and Drake want their revenge, Drake especially, happens in 1568. So we can talk about it, but we can't really focus much of a paragraph on it, if anything. So for commercial rivalry, after Spain shuts down the cloth trade with Antwerp, English merchants are looking to new markets for the New World, but Spain requires these merchants to have a licence. However, English traders like John Hawkins are ignoring this when they are carrying out the trade in enslaved Africans. In 1572, then, at Nombre de Dios, Drake attacked a Spanish port and seized silver worth £20,000. This was revenge for San Juan de Ulua in 1568. And most famously, in 1579, Drake captured £140,000 from the Cacafuego, the Spanish treasure ship. That would be all be an agree. That's all about the trade and commercial rivalry. In our disagree paragraph, our first one, we have political rivalry, which you should focus this on the Netherlands, which is controlled by Spain. Now, this placed Spanish power close to England. If Spain fully controlled the Netherlands, they could launch an invasion far more easily, and it puts Elizabeth in direct physical danger. Now, after a pacification of Ghent in 1576, this peace treaty, Elizabeth lent the Dutch rebels £100,000 to support them, and when Spain broke the pacification and invaded again, Elizabeth hired the mercenaries mercenary John Casimir to lead 6,000 volunteers to help the Dutch. Now, a mercenary is somebody who is paid to go and fight for you. They're not fighting out of political loyalty, they're fighting because they're being paid to be loyal. Elizabeth then also gives the Duke of Alençon £70,000 to fight the Spanish benevolence in the 1580s, and both Casimir and Alençon are unsuccessful. They can't help defeat Spain, and when William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch rebels, was assassinated in 1584, Elizabeth has a difficult choice. If she chooses to lead the rebels, she's going to war with Spain directly. If she chooses not to lead the rebels, they're going to get overwhelmed and England's going to be at risk of invasion. And our final disagreed paragraph is religious rivalry. You can't really talk about the religious settlement too much, but you can say how it created tension with Catholic Spain in the 1570s and 80s. Arguably more important, though, for our question is the excommunication of Elizabeth by the Pope in 1570 after a revolt of the Northern Earls. Catholics were encouraged to see Elizabeth as illegitimate. This leads to a Rodolphi plot in 1571, so Philip II and the Duke of Alba, both Spanish, were involved. The plan was to send 10,000 soldiers to invade, and then in 1584, the Treaty of Joinville, Spain and France become allies against Protestantism in England. Technically, it's a French Catholic League, but it is still Spain and France teaming together when they haven't done so at any point up to then. You could write about direct intervention in benevolence in 1585 as a paragraph, so you could write about the Treaty of Nonsuch and Robert Dudley becoming Governor-General of Low Countries, which infuriated Philip and Elizabeth. But that's just 1 year of our time frame, and I would advise you to talk about 3 factors which span a much wider time frame. So, reintroduction. I agree with the statement because commercial rivalry was the main reason for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations between 1569 and 1585. Political and religious rivalry were serious, but commercial rivalry created repeated flashpoints, such as Drake's attacks at Nombre de Dios and the Cacafuego, which damaged Spanish interests and made England look like a growing threat to Spain's empire. So this agrees because commercial rivalry, unlike the other two, threatened Spain's empire and damaged Spain. I would disagree paragraph. I would disagree introduction. I disagree with the statement because political and religious rivalry were more important reasons for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations than commercial rivalry. Although English attacks on Spanish trade angered Philip II, benevolence and religion created a more direct threat because Elizabeth supported rebels close to England and became part of a wider Protestant Catholic struggle against Spain. So this is talking about benevolence and religion being more direct than commercial rivalry. Here's our agreed paragraph on commercial rivalry. So in bold, the first sentence links to the question. I agree with the statement because commercial rivalry was a major reason for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations between 1569 and 1585. Then we have our knowledge. English merchants looked for new markets in the New World after Spain shut down the cloth trade with Antwerp, which pushed them towards Spain's empire in the Americas. Spain required merchants in the New World to have a license, but English traders such as John Hawkins ignored this when trading enslaved Africans. Commercial rivalry became even more serious when Francis Drake attacked Nombre de Dios in 1572 and seized silver worth £20,000, then captured the Cacafuego in 1579 and took £140,000. This worsened Anglo-Spanish relations because England was directly challenging Spain's control of New World trade and damaging Spanish wealth. Philip II increasingly saw English sailors as pirates, especially because Elizabeth secretly supported privateers and benefited from their profits. This agrees with the statement because commercial rivalry repeatedly caused direct conflict between England and Spain and made Spain see England as a serious threat to its overseas empire. Here's our disagreed paragraph on political rivalry. So, in bold, linked to the question. I disagree with the statement because political rivalry in the Netherlands was also a major reason for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations between 1569 and 1585. Spain controlled the Netherlands, which made Elizabeth fear that Spain could use the Netherlands as a base for invasion. After the pacification of Ghent in 1576, Elizabeth lent the Dutch rebels £100,000, and when Spain attacked again, she hired the mercenary John Casimir to lead 6,000 volunteers to help the Dutch. Elizabeth also supported the Duke of Alençon with £70,000 to fight the Spanish in the Netherlands, and after William of Orange was assassinated in 1584, she faced increasing pressure to support the Dutch rebels more directly. This worsened Anglo-Spanish relations because Elizabeth was interfering in territory ruled by Philip II and helping rebels fighting against Spanish authority. If the rebels were defeated, Spain could launch an invasion of England. This disagrees with the statement because political rivalry in the Netherlands created a more direct strategic threat than commercial rivalry, as it brought England and Spain closer to war. So this one is arguing that the political rivalry is the main reason that England and Spain are closer to war compared to the commercial rivalry, because it could lead to a Spanish invasion of England, unlike the commercial rivalry. Finally, not on spreading influence here, but of course on religious rivalry. I disagree with the statement because religious rivalry was another major reason for worsening Anglo-Spanish relations between 1569 and 1585. Elizabeth's Protestant religious settlement created tension with Catholic Spain because Philip II saw himself as a defender of Catholicism. This tension grew after the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, which encouraged Catholics to launch a religious crusade, key terminology, to overthrow her. Religious rivalry also appeared in the Ridolfi plot of 1571, which involved Philip II, the Duke of Alba, and became even more serious in 1584 when the Treaty of Joinville made Spain and France allies against Protestantism in England. This worsened Anglo-Spanish relations because religion turned the rivalry into a conflict over Elizabeth's right to rule and the future of religion in Europe. This disagrees with the statement because religious rivalry made Anglo-Spanish relations more dangerous than commercial rivalry alone, as it linked Spain to Catholic opposition and threats against Elizabeth herself. So this is arguing religion's more important because it's more of a threat to Elizabeth. Let's have a look at our conclusions. In conclusion, I agree with the statement. Admittedly, someone might disagree because political rivalry in the Netherlands and religious rivalry after Elizabeth's excommunication made relations more dangerous and ideological. However, I agree more because commercial rivalry repeatedly turned tension into direct conflict. English attacks on Spanish ports and treasure damaged Spain's wealth, provoked Spain's anger, and helped push both countries from rivalry towards open hostility. So, this argues commercial rivalry is the main reason because it turned tension into actual physical conflict. And disagree one, unsurprisingly, takes a different line. So, in conclusion, I disagree with the statement. Admittedly, someone might agree because commercial rivalry caused serious tension, especially when Drake attacked Spanish wealth at Nombre de Dios and captured Cacafuego. However, I disagree more because political and religious rivalry posed a greater strategic threat. Elizabeth's support for the Dutch rebels challenged Spanish power close to England, while Protestant-Catholic rivalry linked Spain to attempts to undermine Elizabeth's rule. So it's about the strategic nature of the threat here rather than it being a direct challenge. So that brings an end to the predicted paper walkthrough for Elizabeth Paper B. Hope you found it useful and hopefully you were able to use the mark schemes and the model answers to self-assess your own answers. Thank you very much for watching.